Whispers of history.
In the quiet coastal towns of Maine, the winds carry more than just the scent of salt water and pine. They carry whispers, stories etched into the marrow of New England folklore. Tales that make the living shudder, even while the dead remain silent. Among these stories, one stands apart, the tale of a bride, dressed in white, who was carried to her grave long before her time. Not by murder in the traditional sense, nor by an accident upon the road, but by a mistake so chilling that it forces us to question the very boundaries between life and death. Her name was whispered in church pews and hushed in kitchens warmed by firelight. But the event itself could never be spoken of without a pause, a silence heavy with fear. In 1883, in a town where everyone seemed to know each other's lives and secrets, a young bride was laid into the earth, her wedding gown folded delicately around her like the last embrace of innocence. But beneath that quiet funeral, a darker truth lingered. She had not yet left the realm of the living. She was buried alive. In the 19th century, the fear of premature burial was very real. It haunted families across America and Europe, a shadow that stretched from medical journals to the smallest rural communities. Doctors of the time debated the signs of true death. Clergy reassured grieving families that their loved ones had indeed passed, and yet, every so often, the earth would tell a different story. Coffins unearthed years later showed scratch marks along the lid, bones twisted in unnatural postures, and mouths frozen in silent screams. The horror was not fiction, nor exaggeration, but a terrifying possibility in a world where medicine was still struggling to keep pace with the mysteries of the human body. And into this world stepped our bride. She was young, beautiful, and full of hope for a future that should have stretched ahead of her like an open road. The day of her wedding should have been a celebration, a binding of two families beneath the blessings of God and community. But instead, the event took on an altogether different tone. A sudden illness struck her shortly before she was to walk down the aisle, an illness that left her pale and still, her breaths shallow enough to escape notice. In the panic of the moment, the family, guided by both grief and the advice of those they trusted, believed her gone. The coffin was prepared, the funeral was swift, and the bride, still clad in white lace, was placed into the cold soil of Maine, the ground closing above her like the final chapter of a book unfinished. But whispers began almost immediately. Some claimed to hear faint cries at night near the cemetery. Others spoke of dreams in which the bride appeared, her hands bloodied, her mouth open in a soundless plea. The church tried to quiet these rumors, assuring the town that grief was playing tricks on weary minds. Yet when some began to argue that the bride may not have been truly dead, a chilling wave of doubt spread through the community. Had they buried one of their own alive? The image is unbearable. The coffin's darkness, the smothering air, the pounding of her fists against the wooden lid. What final thoughts would have consumed her as the realization set in? What terror fills a mind when it understands that no one is coming to save them? This is the story that haunted Maine in 1883. Not just the story of a bride and her untimely fate, but of a community forced to confront a horror they could not easily name. It is a tale that lingers in folklore, reminding us of the fragility of life, the fallibility of human judgment, and the thin, almost invisible line that separates the living from the dead. Tonight, we will step into that story together. We will walk the winding streets of a 19th century Maine town, feel the chill of the Atlantic winds, and sit with the silence of a grieving family who made a mistake that history would never allow them to forget. We will sift through the cultural fears of premature burial, the scientific limitations of the era, and the superstitions that amplified the horror until it became something larger than a single tragedy. And as we do, remember this: when we speak of the bride who was buried alive, we are not just telling a ghost story. We are opening a window into a time when death itself was uncertain, and when the most terrifying fate imaginable could unfold beneath the soil of your own churchyard. To understand the horror of the bride buried alive in 1883 Maine, we must step back into the landscape of 19th century America, a world that looked familiar in some ways and alien in others. Maine, with its rugged coastline, endless forests, and small towns scattered along the Atlantic, was a place where life was harsh but steady, and traditions ran deep. People lived by the rhythms of the sea, the turning of the seasons, and the strict patterns of religious devotion. In towns like the one where our bride lived, the church bell was the heart of the community, marking births, marriages, and deaths. These milestones gave meaning to lives often defined by hard work and uncertainty. The 1800s were a century of both progress and fear. Industrialization had begun to reshape parts of the country, but in rural Maine, people still lived simply, close to the earth and bound by faith. At the same time, the medical profession was in a precarious state. Doctors were respected, but not fully trusted, for they often knew little more about disease than the common people. The germ theory of illness was only beginning to take root. Antibiotics were decades away. Many relied on folk remedies, herbal cures, and prayers as much as on physicians. In such a setting, the line between life and death could easily blur. Premature burial was not just a superstition. It was a legitimate fear woven into the culture of the 19th century. Medical journals of the time were filled with debates about how to distinguish true death from a death-like trance or coma. Stories circulated across the Atlantic of exhumations that revealed horrifying truths. Bodies twisted in unnatural positions, coffins marked with scratches, fingernails broken from frantic attempts to escape. These tales were published in newspapers, whispered in parlors, and passed along like grim folklore. The fear became so widespread that inventors patented safety coffins, devices equipped with bells, air tubes, or flags that allowed the undead, supposedly dead, to signal for help if they awakened underground. New England was not immune to such fears. Maine, with its deeply religious communities, added another layer. The belief that premature burial could be a punishment, a form of divine judgment, or even a supernatural occurrence. For families already grieving, the possibility that they had interred a loved one alive was too terrible to face directly. Instead, it became the stuff of whispered legends, half believed and half denied. Marriage in this time and place was not just a union of two people, but a binding of families, fortunes, and futures. Weddings were public, sacred ceremonies that marked the passage from youth to adulthood. A bride represented purity, hope, and continuity. To lose a bride was to cut off that future, and to lose her in such a way, taken to her grave before her vows could be spoken, was a communal tragedy. The community itself felt the loss, for every wedding was a shared event, attended by neighbors, blessed by clergy, and remembered for years. The town where the story unfolded was like many others in Maine. Modest homes with white clapboard siding, narrow dirt roads, a church at the center, and a cemetery not far from its doors. Cemeteries in the 19th century were more than resting places for the dead. They were also sites of reflection, teaching the living about the fragility of life. Families would gather there not only to mourn, but to walk, to contemplate, to remind their children of mortality. A bride's grave, especially one so young, would have been a cruel marker amid those rows of stone, a wound carved into the town's memory. The cultural backdrop of 1883 America was also shaped by Victorian ideals of mourning. Death was ritualized, wrapped in layers of etiquette and symbolism. Families observed strict mourning periods, wearing black clothing, veils, or armbands to signal their grief. Hair of the deceased was sometimes woven into jewelry. Funeral customs were elaborate, and coffins were often displayed in homes before burial. In this context, the quick funeral of the bride would have stood out. Illness might explain it. Disease often required hasty burials to prevent contagion. But the haste also left little time for certainty, little time to distinguish sleep from death. Science, too, was caught between progress and ignorance. Physicians attempted to prove death with methods that seem bizarre today, placing mirrors beneath nostrils to check for breath, using hot irons to test for pain response, even applying leeches or cutting the skin to watch for blood flow. None of these were foolproof. Catalepsy, coma, and certain fevers could mimic death convincingly. In an age without modern monitoring equipment, mistakes were inevitable. The bride's story thus emerges not as a singular tragedy, but as the culmination of these forces. The cultural weight of marriage, the fear of premature burial, the uncertainty of medicine, and the communal anxiety that hovered around death. It is important to remember that this was not an isolated tale, but part of a broader historical moment. Across America, Families lived with the knowledge that their loved one's final rest might not be final at all. Folklore collected from Maine during the late 19th and early 20th centuries reflects this anxiety. Stories of coffins opened to reveal signs of struggle were told around firesides, sometimes as warnings to children, sometimes as explanations for strange sounds at night. The figure of the buried bride fit easily into this cultural framework. The young woman silenced before her vows, trapped not only in earth but in memory. In reflecting on the setting of 1883 Maine, we must see more than just the bride's personal misfortune. We must see the society that shaped her fate, a society balancing between tradition and science, faith and fear. Her burial was not only the act of grieving parents and a mistaken doctor, but also the enactment of a community's rituals, a reflection of their limited understanding of the human body and their desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos of death. Thus, when we speak of the bride who was buried alive, we are also speaking of 19th century Maine itself, a place where the living and the dead were bound tightly together, where cemeteries were part of everyday life, and where the possibility of waking beneath the soil was a nightmare shared by all. The day of the wedding was meant to be one of joy. Families from both sides had gathered. Neighbors had whispered in excitement. And the churchyard was dressed with garlands of evergreen, a simple but heartfelt gesture in a small Maine town where resources were scarce but traditions were rich. The bride, pale but smiling, stood before her mirror in her family's modest home. Her gown had been sewn carefully by her mother and sisters, each stitch holding the weight of expectation. Yet as the final touches were made, a sudden weakness overtook her. She collapsed before the mirror, her body trembling, her breath shallow and almost imperceptible. The laughter in the room turned to screams, and within minutes the home filled with panic. The town doctor was summoned, a man who had studied medicine in Boston but returned to serve his own people. He examined her with the tools he had, checking her pulse, lifting her eyelids, holding a mirror beneath her nostrils. No breath fogged the glass. No pulse could be found beneath his fingers. Her skin, already pale from weeks of fatigue, took on a waxen quality. After a tense silence, he pronounced what no family ever wishes to hear. She was gone. Grief fell heavily over the household. The guests who had come to celebrate were hushed and bewildered. The groom, stunned beyond speech, fell into a chair and buried his face in his hands. A wedding had become a funeral in a single afternoon. Following the customs of the time, the family moved quickly. Disease was always feared, and bodies were often buried without delay. The bride was dressed not in mourning black, but in the white of her wedding gown. Her veil was laid across her still face, and her hands were folded around a small wooden cross. The coffin was prepared by neighbors, lined with cloth, the wood smelling faintly of pine resin. The family insisted on a simple ceremony, their voices breaking as hymns were sung in the church. Within hours, she was lowered into the ground, the earth covering her with frightening finality. The sound of dirt striking the wooden lid rang through the mourners like a cruel bell. But if we pause there, we must consider the possibility that what the doctor saw was not death at all. Catalepsy, a condition not uncommon in the 19th century, could render the body stiff and unresponsive, mimicking death with horrifying accuracy. A coma brought on by sudden illness, fever, or shock might slow the pulse beyond the recognition of untrained hands. Whatever the cause, the bride's body had not yet surrendered life, and beneath the ground, her eyes may have opened. Imagine the moment she awoke. Darkness absolute pressing against her eyes. The air thick and suffocating, each breath harder than the last. Her hands folded neatly upon her chest, moving now with frantic desperation. The lid above her unyielding, the coffin walls pressing close. She would have screamed, but in the earth, no scream travels far. She would have clawed at the wood, her fingernails splintering, her palms torn, her voice ragged with hopeless cries. Each second, a reminder that no one was listening, no one was coming. In the days that followed, the town settled uneasily. The abruptness of her death disturbed many, but few dared to voice their doubts aloud. Then the rumors began. A farmer passing by the cemetery claimed to hear faint noises at night, muffled cries beneath the soil. A child swore she saw the figure of the bride, her veil tattered, standing between the gravestones at dawn. Such stories were dismissed as imagination, as the tricks of grief, yet they spread quickly, whispered in kitchens, murmured during Sunday sermons. The groom grew restless, his grief twisted by unease. He began to dream of her, dreams too vivid to ignore. In them, she reached out to him, her hands raw and bleeding, her mouth opening in a scream that never ended. He woke night after night, drenched in sweat, certain that something was wrong. At last, tormented beyond reason, he returned to the cemetery under cover of darkness. With trembling hands, he placed his ear against the fresh soil, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, faint, almost imperceptible, he thought he heard movement. A scraping, a muffled moan. When he told the family, they begged him to stay silent. To disturb a grave was unthinkable, a sin against both God and community. But the seed of doubt had already taken root. Others confessed to hearing things too, noises in the night, shadows moving among the headstones. The pressure mounted until, days later, the decision was made to open the grave. The coffin was exhumed before dawn, the men of the town working quickly, shovels striking the earth in tense rhythm. When at last the lid was pried open, the sight that met their eyes froze them in horror. The bride's body was no longer arranged in peace. Her head was turned violently to the side, her face twisted in terror. Her veil was torn, her fingernails broken and bloody. The wood of the coffin lid bore deep scratches, grooves carved in desperate effort. Her mouth was open wide, lips torn as if from screaming until her last breath. The crowd recoiled. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Others turned away, unable to look. The groom collapsed to the ground, his cries echoing through the cemetery like the very screams she had given in her final struggle. The truth could no longer be denied. The bride had been buried alive. From that day, the town was never the same. The church tried to frame the event as God's will, a mystery beyond human understanding. But the people could not forget the sight of her ruined hands, the sound of her groom's wailing, the weight of their own silence. The grave became a site of dread, avoided by children and adults alike. Some claimed that even after the second burial, the earth never settled properly, as though refusing to hide what had been done. The insidious detail of this tragedy lies not only in the bride's fate, but in what it revealed about the living. Their fear of disease, their haste in following ritual, their trust in fragile science, all combined to create a mistake so monstrous that it haunted them for generations. The coffin was more than her prison. It was a mirror held up to a society that desperately wanted certainty in a world full of uncertainty. And so the legend grew. Each retelling added shadows. The sound of fingernails scratching in the night, the glimpse of a white figure among the trees, the echo of muffled cries on the wind. Whether or not the stories were true no longer mattered. The bride's tragedy had crossed into folklore, becoming part of the fabric of the town's memory, a constant reminder of the thin veil between life and death. When the coffin was opened and the terrible truth revealed, silence fell upon the cemetery. The horror etched on the bride's face was not just her own. It imprinted itself on everyone present. For days afterward, the small town in Maine was subdued, as though even the air carried the weight of guilt. Conversations lowered to whispers. Doors closed earlier at night. The ordinary rhythm of village life had been broken, replaced by unease that settled over every home. The bride's family bore the heaviest burden. Her mother wept until her voice gave out, blaming herself for urging haste in the burial, fearing the spread of sickness. Her father withdrew into silence, unable to meet the eyes of neighbors, his shame manifest in his bowed posture. The sisters who had sewn her gown no longer entered the room where it had been prepared. They left her belongings untouched, a haunting shrine to the day that should have been her happiest. The groom's grief was of another kind, fierce, bitter, and restless. He walked the fields at night, muttering to himself, plagued by guilt that he had not fought harder to prevent her burial. Some claimed to see him kneeling at her grave long after midnight, whispering apologies to the earth itself. Others said he began to speak of her as though she were still alive, that he felt her presence in every corner of his house, her breath in the silence before dawn. Whether this was madness or devotion, no one could say, but the townsfolk avoided his gaze, afraid to confront the rawness of his sorrow. The town doctor, once respected for his training and knowledge, found his reputation shattered. People no longer trusted his words with the same reverence. Mothers hesitated to bring their sick children to him. Fathers questioned his judgment in public. He defended himself by citing the limitations of medicine, reminding them that faint pulses and shallow breathing often deceived even the most experienced physicians. But his words fell flat. The townspeople whispered that he had condemned the bride through incompetence, that he had not listened closely enough, not waited long enough, not cared enough to be certain. His hands, once steady, trembled when he tried to practice. Eventually, he retreated into near isolation, leaving behind the calling that had once defined him. The pastor tried to offer comfort, but his sermons only deepened the unease. He spoke of God's will, of mysteries beyond human comprehension, of the thin line between life and death. Yet the congregation could not escape the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong, not in the heavens, but among themselves. Was it not their own fear and haste that had condemned her? Was it not their own voices that had called for burial before the sun had even set? The pastor, sensing his flock's unrest, began to avoid the subject altogether, filling his sermons with more abstract themes. But the silence was deafening. Faith itself seemed shaken. For what use was divine order if it permitted such a mistake? Neighbors, once bound together by the close ties of small-town life, now turned against one another. Some blamed the family for rushing the burial, others accused the doctor, and still others insisted the pastor should have demanded more caution. Accusations simmered beneath polite exchanges, surfacing in bitter arguments after church services or at the town market. The tragedy had not only destroyed one life, it had fractured the community's trust in itself. Rumors spread quickly, as rumors always do in the absence of certainty. Children were told not to linger in the graveyard, lest they hear the bride's cries echoing from beneath the ground. Women whispered that her ghost walked the roads at night, her veil drifting like smoke. Men claimed to see lights moving in the cemetery, faint and flickering, as though her restless spirit refused to rest. Whether these were inventions of guilty minds or genuine experiences, they fed into a collective dread. The local newspaper, hungry for stories that would draw attention, seized upon the tale. Its columns spoke in hushed tones of a dreadful mistake and a most lamentable tragedy, but between the lines, readers found accusations. The article questioned whether rural doctors were capable of distinguishing death from illness, whether families should trust tradition over caution. Copies of the paper were read and reread until the ink smudged. Travelers passing through carried the story with them, and soon it was whispered in neighboring towns, then across the state. What had begun as a private sorrow became a public shame. In the broader culture of the late 19th century, this story struck a deep nerve. Fear of premature burial was not new. It had haunted humanity for centuries, but in this case the nightmare had unfolded in full view of an entire community. It became a cautionary tale, fueling debates about safety coffins, about new medical instruments to confirm death, about the need to delay burials until every possibility of life was extinguished. For the townspeople, however, these discussions offered little solace. Science might progress, but no invention could undo what had been done to their bride. Psychologically, the incident gnawed at every witness. Some developed a heightened fear of being buried alive themselves, demanding that their loved ones wait days, even weeks, before consigning them to the ground. Others became obsessed with the notion of living death, checking their own pulses, studying their reflections in mirrors for signs of fading life. The line between superstition and science blurred, as the mind struggled to make sense of what had happened. There were also those who embraced denial, insisting that the rumors were exaggerated, that the scratches in the coffin were nothing more than decay and shifting wood. They clung to this version not out of reason, but out of necessity, for to believe the truth was unbearable. And so the community fractured further. Between those who accepted the horror and those who sought to bury it again, this time beneath layers of silence, the bride's grave became both a place of mourning and a symbol of dread. Flowers were left there, but always in haste, as though the living feared to linger. On certain nights, when the wind moved strangely through the trees, even the bravest avoided the cemetery. Her name was spoken less and less until, at last, it was reduced to a whisper, a story told to children to frighten them into obedience. Yet the memory endured. It endured in the haunted look of the groom who never remarried. It endured in the doctor's empty practice. It endured in the uneasy glances exchanged by townsfolk when conversation drifted too close to the past. The bride, who had never lived to see her wedding night, remained more present in death than she ever could have been in life. And perhaps that was the cruelest reaction of all. Not the wailing grief of her family, not the hollow sermons of the pastor, not the whispered accusations of neighbors, but the silence that followed. A silence so heavy it seemed to stretch across generations, binding the town to its guilt. The people could not undo the burial, but they could bury their words, their doubts, their very memory of her. In doing so, they preserved her not as a woman of flesh and spirit, but as a ghostly presence, a reminder of a mistake they could never erase. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of branches bending under the weight of autumn wind. In the small cemetery, the soil was dark and damp, and the lanterns carried by the gravediggers flickered with each gust. It had been only days since the burial, and yet something gnawed at the hearts of the family, something that would not allow them peace. The mother, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness, swore she had heard cries in her dreams, not vague, not imagined, but sharp, desperate pleas that pierced through her sleep like knives. The groom too confessed he could not shake the feeling that his bride was not gone, that he still felt her presence pressing against him in the night air. At first, such words were dismissed as grief speaking in cruel tones. But as days passed, neighbors whispered of strange sounds near the graveyard, low moans carried on the wind, or faint scratching, like nails against wood. Some laughed nervously, saying sorrow was playing tricks on their ears. Others avoided the cemetery altogether. Yet the unease grew too strong to ignore, until one evening, under the dim glow of lantern light, the family gathered enough courage to act. The decision was made in hushed voices. The coffin would be opened. Not tomorrow, not with ceremony, but tonight, before doubt could drown them in guilt. The gravediggers hesitated, their hands trembling, but the father insisted. The mother wept silently, clutching a small handkerchief as though it were a shield. The groom stood apart from them all, silent and rigid, his face pale as stone. Shovels bit into the damp earth, each strike ringing in the air like a grim tolling bell. With every layer removed, the silence thickened, broken only by the scrape of metal and the thud of earth. The lanterns cast long shadows across the graves, making the carved angels and crosses look like watchers of the scene. At last, wood met metal, and the coffin lid was uncovered. The moment stretched unbearably as the gravediggers pried it open. The wood creaked, reluctant, as though it too wished to keep its secret hidden. When the lid finally gave way, the lanterns revealed what lay inside. The bride was not as she had been when they buried her. Her once delicate hands were bloodied and raw, the nails torn down to splinters. Deep scratches marred the interior of the coffin lid, desperate marks carved into the wood in her final struggle. Her face was contorted, frozen in a mask of terror and agony, her mouth open as though caught in a scream that no one had heard. Her wedding gown, once pristine, was shredded by her own frantic grasping. The sight was unbearable, a vision of life betrayed by death too soon declared. The mother let out a cry so piercing it silenced even the wind. She collapsed to the ground, clutching the earth as though she could sink into it and vanish. The father stood rigid, his face blank, his eyes glassy as though the horror had emptied him of thought. The groom stumbled forward, his breath ragged, reaching out a trembling hand toward the body but unable to touch her. His voice broke as he whispered her name, over and over, like a prayer that might summon her back. The doctor, summoned by the urgency of the night, stood at the edge of the lantern light, pale and shaking. He tried to mutter explanations, catalepsy, suspended animation, deceptive illness, but the words fell lifeless, meaningless in the face of what was before them. His authority dissolved in that instant, crushed beneath the weight of the evidence lying in the coffin. He could no longer stand tall as a man of science. He was merely another witness to a horror too great to bear. The pastor crossed himself and began to pray aloud, his voice trembling. Yet even the sacred words seemed fragile, powerless against the reality. The air grew heavy, as though the night itself recoiled. Every person present knew they were standing in the aftermath of a mistake that was not merely human but cosmic, a failure of perception so catastrophic it bordered on the supernatural. Some said they felt a cold wind sweep through the cemetery at that moment, though the night was still. Others swore they heard a faint echo, a cry that did not belong to the living, but which seemed to seep from the coffin itself, carried on the lantern-lit air. The gravediggers, hardened men accustomed to death, turned pale and refused to meet one another's eyes. One crossed himself so fervently his knuckles turned white. then fled the graveyard altogether. The silence that followed was unbearable, yet none dared to break it. They stood in a ring around the coffin, each staring into the terrible truth of what lay before them, each bearing the weight of complicity. For it was not merely the doctor's misjudgment, nor the family's haste, nor the pastor's complacency. It was all of them, the whole community, who had consigned her to the earth while she still breathed. The mother fainted, her body crumpling beside the open grave. The groom knelt, sobbing uncontrollably, his cries echoing across the cemetery. He clutched her torn veil in his hands as though by holding it, he could anchor her spirit. The father's face twisted at last, releasing a guttural sound not of words but of something deeper. A sound of a man crushed beyond repair. The coffin was left open that night, the lanterns burning low as the hours stretched on. No one dared to close it again, for to seal it felt like repeating the crime. Some say that even when dawn came, the graveyard seemed darker than the day deserved. Birds did not sing, and the air smelled faintly of iron, as though the earth itself bore witness to what it had held. From that night forward, nothing in the town was the same. Weddings were postponed, funerals delayed, and whispers filled the air like a disease of the mind. The bride, who had been buried too soon, had risen in memory larger than life. She haunted not through apparition, but through the silence, the guilt, and the knowledge etched into every soul who had stood at her grave. And in that graveyard, beneath the swaying trees and the shifting shadows, the scratches on the coffin remained, marks carved not in wood, but into the hearts of all who looked upon them. Marks that could never be erased. In the months that followed, the town of Maine did not return to normal. The fields still yielded their crops, the carriages still rattled down the dirt roads, the church bells still tolled each Sunday, but beneath the surface, something had changed. The story of the bride who had been buried alive was no longer just the sorrow of one family. It had become the silent burden of the entire community. People walked a little slower past the cemetery, their eyes avoiding the row of fresh graves. No one dared to mention her name in casual conversation, as though speaking it aloud might call her spirit back from the restless place where it lingered. The family moved through their days like shadows. The father aged seemingly overnight, his back bent, his voice cracked, his once commanding presence hollowed by grief. The mother retreated inward, whispering prayers to herself as if to bargain with a heaven that had betrayed her. The groom, perhaps the most broken of all, wandered in silence. Some claimed they saw him at dusk near the graveyard, standing at the edge of the earth where she had been laid, clutching a piece of her torn veil in his hands. He rarely spoke after that night, as though words had lost all meaning in a world where such horror could exist. Rumors spread quickly, as they always did in small towns. Some swore the bride's cries could still be heard in the wind on certain nights, long after the grave was opened. Others said they saw her figure moving in the distance, a pale shape in the fog, her gown torn and dirty, her eyes wide with the terror of her final moments. Most dismissed these tales as imagination fed by guilt, but they carried a weight that refused to fade. Children were warned not to wander too close to the cemetery after dusk. Couples hesitated before scheduling weddings, fearing their union might be cursed by her memory. The incident also stirred debates beyond the town's borders. Doctors from neighboring cities came to argue about what had happened, each offering explanations rooted in science: catalepsy, nervous disorders, undetectable illnesses. They spoke confidently in lecture halls, far from the grave, as though knowledge alone could undo the horror. But the townspeople who had seen the coffin and the scratches carved into its wood remained unconvinced. Science might explain the failure of the body, but it could not erase the screams that haunted their nights. The church, too, struggled with the weight of the tragedy. The pastor who had prayed over her funeral began to question his own faith. Was it a sin to bury her too soon? Or had it been fate, some inscrutable design written by a hand greater than their own? His sermons grew heavy with themes of doubt, of human blindness, of the thin veil between life and death. Some found solace in his words. Others drifted away, unable to bear the reminder of the grave that had become the town's darkest secret. In time, the grave itself became something of a legend. Travelers who heard the story would come to see it, standing in hushed reverence before the headstone. They would touch the cold stone, as if by doing so they could feel the echo of her final struggle. The scratches inside the coffin remained untouched. preserved as though the wood itself resisted decay, holding fast to the memory of the horror it had contained. Some whispered that the marks were not merely physical, but spiritual, etched by despair so profound it left an imprint deeper than the flesh. As years passed, the story blurred at the edges. Some details shifted, others were exaggerated, and new embellishments took root. Yet the core remained, a bride buried alive on her wedding night, clawing desperately at the coffin until silence claimed her. The tale was retold in kitchens, in taverns, in classrooms, shaping itself into folklore. Children grew up with the story as a warning that haste could lead to ruin, that grief could blind, that the boundary between life and death was not always as clear as we believed. Even in its retelling, the story carried weight. It forced people to question the certainty of their world. How many others had been buried too soon, their cries unheard? How many graves in quiet cemeteries concealed not the dead but the silenced? And if such mistakes could happen, what else might lie hidden in the shadows of human understanding? For the family there was no peace. The father died not many years later, his last words whispered into the silence of the night. "Forgive me." The mother lingered longer, her hair turning white, her eyes forever rimmed with tears that no prayer could wash away. The groom disappeared one day, leaving behind only the tattered piece of veil. Some said he wandered into the forest and never returned. Others believed he followed her into the grave, unable to bear the weight of his loss. And so the story settled into the bones of the land. The graveyard remained, the trees still swaying, the earth still shifting with the passing of seasons. Yet those who lived nearby swore that the ground there never felt the same. It was heavier, colder, as though it carried the memory of what had been forced upon it. In the end, the bride became more than just a figure of tragedy. She became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of life, of the fallibility of human judgment, of the terror that waits when we mistake silence for death. Her story was whispered not only as horror but as caution, a thread of unease woven into the fabric of local memory. Perhaps that is the greatest haunting of all. Not the ghostly figure some claim to see, nor the cries some claim to hear, but the thought that we, too, might one day stand on the wrong side of certainty, that in our haste, in our blindness, we might bury the living and call it peace. And when the wind rustles through the cemetery at night, carrying faint sounds that may be nothing more than branches scratching against one another, those who hear it cannot help but shiver. For in that sound they are reminded of her final struggle, of the coffin clawed from within, and of the scream that never reached the air. The bride may rest beneath the earth, but her story does not. It lingers restless, carried not in the soil, but in the hearts of all who remember.